It's really both an honor and a pleasure not only to be here, but also to have the opportunity to engage with Donniel on his book, which I see that on your chairs you should have some form of the workbook version of the book, Putting God Second. You know, I think that to understand a book, you have to read it once. To critique a book, you have to read it twice. And so I've read the book twice. And I want to engage with Donniel on a few questions. I'm going to assume that people haven't read the book. So there might be a few passages that I might want to read, but my assumption is that people haven't read it. So if you have read it, then some of this stuff will sound familiar to you. For those of you that don't know, well, now you all have it, Putting God Second, How to Save Religion from Itself. It's funny it's only when I read, I told Donniel this the other day, it's only when I read the book the second time that I realized how subversive it was. When I read it the first time, I said, okay, I think I get it. And when I read it the second time, it was like, whoa, there's a lot going on in here. So I want to engage with Donniel a little bit on this. First, I want to ask you a kind of a meta question. The subtitle of the book, How to Save Religion from Itself, really underlies the basic thesis. And the basic thesis of the book is that there's an inner tension in religion. Not just Judaism. Judaism is just an example of religion more generally. And that inner tension is that religion very often results in products that seem to undermine its very intention. And what Donniel is trying to do in the book is saying, first of all, he's saying that he feels that religion can overcome its negative consequences and can actually save itself from oblivion. But the first question I want to pose to you is, it might seem like a klutz kasha, but I don't think it necessarily is. And that is, why religion at all? Why should it necessarily save itself? Why do we have to go through the kinds of things that you do in the book to save religion from itself, as opposed to saying, let's create another model of humanism, and let's let religion go the way of other things in the world and pass on. So why religion would be my first question.
First of all, because religion is. Religion is an integral part of our lives. Religion is shaping world history. Those who think that they could change, or the atheist fantasy that the era of religion is past, is simply that, it's a fantasy. It is a reality in our lives, and it's also a reality that there's two levels. It's reality in our lives, and it's also a reality in my life. And so on the one level, I think new atheists are basically, it's a strange phenomena, the fascination with new atheists, because I'm wondering who they're writing for. If they're writing for atheists, then it has a voyeuristic type of critique to it. But if they're writing to people of faith, for a person of faith, excluding God from their life and exiting religion as a solution is like a successful operation and the patient dies. It's like something that it's not even a reality. God is here. And not only is God here, God is both positively but also adversely affecting our lives and our world. And so I want to first speak to those people for whom religion is an integral part of their life. Now, throughout the book, I don't assume that belief in God is necessary to be a good person. And I don't assume that the only way to lead a meaningful life is to believe in God and to enter into a religious system. But the majority of the world is there. And when you offer a prescription or when you offer a criticism where most people are, and your solution or your critique is basically don't be who you are, like leave the system, there's something profoundly irrelevant about it. But the other reason is I wrote the book for myself. See, I love being a Jew. but I don't like everything that Judaism is doing to us. I want a different Judaism. I didn't write this book as a critique of Islamic fundamentalism. I wrote it in conversation with a bunch of committed religious people here in the state of Israel. Those are the people I was talking to. This is a book which is trying to set a vision for a different Israel. Now, I think Islam and Christianity have to do the same, and the first version of it is in English. Now it's going through a Hebrew translation. But we have to fight for the world that we want. And all too often, fundamentalism has an unbelievable impact on the world, not by creating people who are fundamentalists, but by dominating what religion means and causing most of us to think that we have no place in it. I want to save religion from itself because I want to save it as something that religious people could feel at home with, that they could respect, that they could value. And so this is a book for religious people on how we can create a better Judaism, a better Christianity, and a better Islam. For those who are outside of the conversation, there's another book, but that wasn't what this book was for.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, coming from the diaspora, that where religion has a very different kind of valence. It seems that from the argument in the book, religion becomes the most dangerous when it attains political power.
That's correct.
Right. When it attains policing power.
Correct.
And so, in a sense, it's really a book about the survival of Judaism empowered.
Or Christianity or Islam empowered.
Or Christianity empowered. But
Right.
in the particular case of
That's
Judaism, where the classical Zionists came and didn't bring Judaism with them, but created another kind of power structure that was arguably, in some way, more humanitarian or didn't have the same kinds of challenges. So I'm wondering if you see that the problem is less religion per se and the mixture of religion and the political.
I think that's a good point. See, all injustice is conditional on power.
Right.
So this is no unique feature. It's whether it's political power, whether it's communal power. So the potential, we Jews were always a moral people as long as we were powerless.
Precisely, right.
Precisely. So, but religion is about living a life empowered in this world. You remember the famous midrash where the angels say to God, "Why are you giving them Torah? This is this beautiful creation that you have. Why are you giving it to them?" And God says, "I don't know. Moses, do you have an answer?" Literally. And he says, "Moses, could you please tell them an answer?" And Moses says, "What's written in this Torah? Do you work 6 days a week that you need a Shabbat? Do you have evil inclinations that you need laws against adultery and incest?" Now, religion is about people who have the potential and the capacity to do harm to themselves or those who are surrounding them. And it's ostensibly supposed to move us in a better direction.
Right.
But when it is precisely that doesn't do it, when religion comes and says, "I want to help you be a better person," and precisely the more faithful you are, you become more corrupt. The more faithful you are, the more blind you are. The more you see God, the less you see other human beings. Houston, we have a problem. And so many people say, "No, we don't have a problem." They're just not religious enough. It's like like you're full, eat more. It's like oh, no, I can't eat. No, it's like no. If you just believed a little bit more. But part of what happens is that we don't need more faith. We need a different faith. And this is a book about saying, what could a different faith look like? Because faith is only meaningful in the midst of power, human capacity, our ability to affect the lives of other people. When our traditions tell us, love your neighbor as yourself, it's because you have the potential to hate your neighbor and to actually do them harm.
Right.
And that's not only an Israeli political phenomena. That's embedded, I believe, in the whole religious enterprise. But it is, you're right, accentuated.
Right. So there are two categories that you use throughout the book, a number of categories, but one of the categories that I think is very suggestive is God intoxication and God manipulation. So, classically speaking, the great hero of Judaism, or the great hero of religion, or the great hero of biblical religion, is Abraham. But for you, Abraham is the real problem, at least some of Abraham. So whereas for classical sources up to the modern time, the act of the Akedah, the act of the sacrifice of Isaac, is the epitome of religious intimacy with God. And for you, it's the beginning of a horrible mistake. So I'm wondering, because in a sense, what Abraham does is he chooses God over his own son. Yeah. I'm wondering if you agree with Kant's reading of the Akedah, that actually Abraham did the wrong thing. That when God said, take your son, your only son, and sacrifice him at the altar, or tie him up at the altar, according to Kant, Abraham should have said no. And his willingness to do that was actually an error that has resonated throughout human history. Are you saying that Abraham should have said no?
Abraham should have said no. God wanted him to say yes. And that's the tension. Abraham should have said no, but religion too often thinks that he should have said yes.
Right.
The only thing that Abraham did worse than selling his wife for a sandwich was his willingness to offer his son to God.
Right. So I'm wondering, according to that, whether you think that the problem of Abraham is that he was too much in love with God, that he was too intimate with God, that he couldn't actually see what he was being asked to do.
Part of what I argue in the book is that it's not a flaw of Abraham, but that it's a flaw when human beings encounter God. There's something fundamentally or potentially distorting in monotheism, is that we have created or we have chosen to believe in this one transcendent God. I think it's like a nuclear weapon. It's too big for human beings. Idols are much safer.
Right.
They're small, they're local. You know, like I have my God, you have your God. It's just life's fine. But one God, creator of the universe, and the belief that you actually have that you are chosen by that God. It's like when that one God enters into the room, I believe for too many human beings it blows their fuses. Mm-hmm. I think human beings have a difficulty with assimilating this God within a context of a moral universe. And that's why I argue God has to be put second. Right. If we wanted to choose the direction of idols, I'm good with that. We could do that. But if we're believing in one God, then we have to realize that there's something here that naturally causes us a profound moral blindness. Because when God says to you, Abraham, or he says Shaul or Donniel, it's going to be very natural. Yeah, Hineni, I'm here. Okay, how much do you love? What do you mean how much do you love? You're it. Like there is no God sucks the oxygen out of the world. God sucks the oxygen. And it's not by accident that the Kabbalists wanted to know, how could a world even exist if God exists? Because God is the infinite. So Lurianic Kabbalah comes up with an answer for creation in which God has to contract God's self. But the problem is what happens after creation? Okay, the world's here. We still need that contraction. But if God's not contracting God's self, we need to contract God, because otherwise God is going to distort our consciousness. My argument is that Abraham should have said no, but throughout history, people of monotheistic faith over and over and over again say, sure. Now, the only difference is that we don't usually offer our sons. We usually offer your son. My son, God didn't tell me that. But your son, tell me, sign me up. Now, that inclination, this is what God does to us. When God enters into the room, it's okay for me to kill your son. Your son is fair game. That is the consequence of this story. And I think we have to recognize that danger, because, how many deaths will it take till we know? How many times are we going to kill people in the name of God till we know that let's stop this stupid conversation? Is there Muslim terrorism? Is there Jewish terrorism? Is there Christian terrorism? No, there is no such thing. There happens to be people who, by the way, are Muslim or Christian or Jews, and that has nothing to do with the fact that they're hurting people, even though they're telling you, I'm hurting them because of my religion, and I'm hurting you because you're not part of my religion. And we're sort of dancing around or pussyfooting around this really sweetness. No, they're all distorting religion. We're not distorting religion. This is religion. Now, could we create another religion? But it starts by recognizing that these aren't distortions. Because when you say it's a distortion, you'll continue to make the same mistake over and over and over again. And so Abraham is not the model for people being willing to sacrifice themselves or their families, but the profound moral blindness that a one infinite God could infect on humankind. And we have to see it, we have to identify it, we have to point to it, and then we have to repent for it by saying, let's create a different religious system. Not a religious system that gets rid of God, because God's here, but let's create a different life with God that won't blow the moral fuses of humankind.
There's a Christian theologian named Laurel Schneider who wrote a book called Beyond Monotheism. And she basically talks about what she calls the tyranny of the one.
Right.
And an Egyptologist named Jan Assmann who talks about the Mosaic distinction. In other words, these people are saying something not so dissimilar from what you're saying, that the problem isn't religion, the problem is monotheism.
That's correct.
Right? It's when it's monotheistic religions that kill for God.
That's right.
Other polytheistic religions, or what they call cosmotheistic religions, they kill other people, but not for God. So in a sense, what you're saying, you're suggesting a kind of radical revision of monotheism. They're trying to overcome monotheism.
Yeah, that's a waste of time.
Right. So you're saying the truth is that God is what we make God.
Right, but
Anyway.
we're in the monotheistic conversation.
Right.
It's like there is no do-over.
Right.
And it's both conceptual, but it's also educational.
Right.
Now, could I be an idolater? Maybe. Not likely, but I don't find it that attractive.
Right.
But this is the language that we now speak in.
Right.
And so within that language, it's irrelevant to try to argue. It's, again, academically I can engage in that exercise, or I might get attention. But I'm not going to change the world.
Right.
I'm not going to get a better world by doing that. And I really want to change our world.
Right. No, I see that.
It's like I'm really driven to do that.
Yeah. By the way, I think that it's not monotheism or idolatry. Idolatry is the language of monotheists to what non-monotheists do.
That's correct.
No one calls themselves an idolater. Right.
That's correct.
And the language of polytheism also was created by monotheists.
You're right. Yeah.
So it's just a different conception of how the world is.
Yeah.
Right. So here, the new hero that comes up in your book is Hillel. Hillel is the tikkun for Avraham.
Right.
Right? Because Hillel is the first one that really puts God second.
Right.
And basically says, you know, God, I want some space. You're kind of too much in my face, so I'm going to push you away. And I'm going to put the other human being before you. Right? So it's a kind of Hillelian revision of Abrahamic religion.
That's correct.
Right? So I think my question is that, well, then there's a second Avraham, right? There's the Avraham of Sodom. And the Avraham of Sodom is a different Avraham of the Avraham of the Akedah, because the Avraham of Sodom argues with God to save human beings. But the Avraham of Sodom fails. Ultimately, Sodom doesn't get saved, right? Whereas the Avraham of the Akedah somehow succeeds. God gives him a reward for doing which God hoped he would do or that he wouldn't do? Or I don't know how you want to understand that particular dichotomy. So you have this kind of triangle. You have Abraham 1, Abraham 2, Hillel in the middle. So you want to create a Hillelian Judaism. Right.
And I don't know, by the way, if Abraham fails in the Akedah, in Sdom, because Abraham wanted to ensure that the righteous don't get killed. And in fact, no righteous get killed. Turns out that God had a greater standard than even Abraham did. There were only 4 righteous. So he doesn't fail, but it's there. And like as you could see this morning, I live, sometimes when I dream, I have a Genesis 12 and I have a Genesis 18. I have a Genesis 18 and a Genesis 22. I have a Leviticus 19 and a Leviticus 25. I live with this. It's like all these numbers. It's like, they all symbolize these core basic ideas.
Right.
But Hillel says something remarkable. And people didn't notice how remarkable it was. And sometimes we sort of say it's like a nice saying, but we don't really take it seriously. When someone says, convert me on condition that you could teach me all of Torah while I stand on one foot, and he defines the essence of Judaism as what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others, and says the following line, that's the whole Torah and the rest is commentary. That's an unbelievably radical statement.
Sure.
Now Rashi, the 10th century commentator, he has a hairy he flips. He says, what? You forgot God. And so he tries to rewrite Hillel in a Genesis 22 modality. That the essence of what it means, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. What's hateful unto, just like you don't like it when people don't listen to you, Rashi says, what Hillel really meant is God also doesn't like it when you don't listen to him, so therefore listen to God all the time. And so he tries to read Hillel as a Genesis 22 Jew. But Hillel offers another vision. Hillel offers a vision in which God is on second and ethics is on first. God's on second, or more accurately, your neighbor is on first. And that's a monotheism that I think is enlightening.
Right. I want to get back to that, but I want to add one kind of leading question to that. You have a very radical understanding of Lifnei Meshurat Hadin, of supererogatory behavior, or doing more than the law, although it's complicated to really translate what Lifnei Meshurat Hadin is. Basically what you're saying, as I understand it, is that when we traditionally think of Lifnei Meshurat Hadin, we think that the law is not enough, so I'm going to do more. Your reading of Lifnei Meshurat Hadin is that the law is too much, and so I'm going to do more.
That's correct.
Right.
Or the law, Lifnei Meshurat Hadin is when you go beyond the requirement of the law. And there's 2 dimensions to what it means to go beyond the requirement of the law. And one of them is exactly what you mentioned, is that there are times when the law is simply wrong.
Right.
And that the law is leading you in a wrong direction, and you are obligated to go beyond the requirement of the law. Now, this fact of going beyond the requirement of the law, for much of Judaism, is actually the law. And I quote this text
right.
in Tractate Baba Metzia, which states that the temple was destroyed because the Jewish people only followed the law.
Right.
In other words, to build a society that actually is deserving of survival, you have to go beyond the requirement of the law. It basically assumes that Jewish law is infected with this disease. The Jewish law is infected with potential for moral blindness, and we have to go beyond it, and we have to watch it. It's like, it talks about what it means to be a Jew is not just to follow what Torah says. To be a Jew is to protect Torah. It's just like Abraham in Sdom, who says, will the judge of the whole earth not deal justly? To be a Jew is to look from chapter to chapter and say, yep, okay, we're okay here. No, we're not okay here. And I know that's the law, but you're required to go beyond beyond the law, because it's only in that way that you are who you ought to be. That means for someone who strives their whole life to do what God wants of them, could end up living in hell.
So
Not that I know exactly, but let's.
Right. So if I understand you in a certain way, the way I'm reading you, you're basically saying that classical Reform Judaism got it right.
First of all, some of my best friends are
No.
Reform Jews.
Well, no, yeah, but not the classical, not the 19th century ones. They've long gone.
They've long gone.
But in a sense, the notion of ethical monotheism, as it developed in the 19th century, the notion of Reform Judaism as it moved, as it grew out of the Enlightenment, was basically a Hillelian Judaism that was saying that ultimately the central core requirement of God is that we create an ethical world. Now later it became tikkun olam and all
other
kinds of
things.
So in a way, if I understand you, it's reconstructing a kind of orthodoxy, acknowledging that reform was right in a multicultural age.
No.
Okay, next question.
Because what I'm very careful to over and over again in the book is to argue that religion should not be reduced to the ethical. The Hillelian Hillelian Judaism says that at the end of the day, no part of your religious life could violate the ethical. But it doesn't reduce religion to the ethical, and that's why this is not ethical monotheism. There is a place, and that's the purpose of the ending of the book, like to prevent people from making that mistake. No, ritual is very, very important. Spirituality, faith are important. And so we make a profound error when we reduce, when all of mitzvah is a good deed, when all of Judaism is just being nice. No, there's a profound beauty and significance to ritual and faith and culture and music and art. It's not just about being a good person. A life of value is not exhausted by the ethical. But no life could be of value if it does not live up to the standard of the ethical. That's different than ethical monotheism.
Okay.
Fair
You
enough?
want to unpack that just a little
Sure.
bit more? Right.
Ethical monotheism reduces basically the whole purpose of the divine human encounter to doing the good. That's what ethical monotheism is. That it defines not just the essence of Judaism, but the telos of Judaism. Its ultimate goal is exclusively to create a moral human being. And when you speak about classical reform, it means ritual is basically unnecessary. It doesn't determine whether you're a good Jew or a bad Jew. No, I don't leave it. It's extra baggage that we don't really need to keep, in particular if it separates us from the world in which we're living in. I actually love ritual, but I could love it independent of its ethical principles. Like I love kashrut. I love kashrut because I love the idea that there's a people who eat a similar food. I love the idea that we try to create cultural symbols that define our collective identity. I think it's a really powerful idea. I think it's a really important idea. I think every collective group needs its symbols, and any community which gets rid of its symbols weakens its collective consciousness. And I think kashrut is a really powerful consciousness. And okay, so I'll eat kosher food in a non-kosher restaurant when I go outside. Sue me. Okay, so I don't worry about dishes. Am I right? I'm not making a halachic argument. I don't worry about dishes. I don't worry. And I'm not making a halachic argument. I'm just saying I don't. And so, but when I go, it's like I go as a Jew. I live in the world as a Jew, and I live in the world in the midst of a community with their cult, with their symbols, etc. Now, the Hillelian key says, okay, you keep kosher. And it's important. And it has nothing to do with your ethical standards. But what happens when your kashrut contradicts your ethical responsibilities? What do? And so when I would lecture, when I used to teach college students in America, I taught the significance of kashrut. But I said to them, anybody who, if you, because you've now started to keep kosher, if you don't eat in your parents' home, you're not my student anymore. Like when you go home, if because of your commitment to this ritual, you don't see your parents, you don't feel their angst. Now, I'm not saying eat pork because your mother wants you to eat her recipe for pork. But eat in her home. Eat in your father's home. Eat on their dishes. Eat in their pots. And know that when you're doing so, you're a better Jew. Because that's what Hillel says. That's what it means this is the whole Torah and the rest is commentary. At the end of the day, it's not reduced to the ethical, but it has to pass the ethical test. In other words, nothing could contradict the ethical. When you come up against an ethical, you have to ask yourself, who am I hurting? So I remember when I was a rabbi, I would always, there's no such thing as a Jew's home I wouldn't eat in. No such thing. No such thing. I will eat in everybody's home. Because I want them to know that I see them. I want kashrut to be a vehicle that creates community, not a vehicle that makes people feel that I don't care about them and that they're not part of my sphere of concern. This is not reducing Judaism to the ethical, but it's making sure that the ethical is the test for all of Judaism. And that's the difference between the Judaism I'm advocating for and classic Reform ethical monotheism.
There's a story about Robert Cover, the famous legal theorist from Yale, who was a kind of conservative, traditional Jew and kept kosher. But he said that he never, when he was a guest in someone's home, Jew or non-Jew, he never turned down any food that was offered to him, as an ethical principle.
See, I would turn down food. I'll turn down food that's not well done. And that is part of my honor my mother and my father, because everything had to be burnt when we were raised. And if it wasn't burnt, it's still alive and it's not kosher. So like, I'll turn down, I can't, and I won't eat wheat and I won't eat milk, and I have a whole list.
Okay.
But it's not that I won't turn, there's always something that I could eat. I don't have to eat everything that's offered to me, but there's always something that I could eat. And I'll make sure that the person knows that. And one of the things that happened to me as a rabbi, it was remarkable. When I made this decision to eat in everybody's home, people started calling me beforehand, what could you eat? And then they started to institute kashrut principles more stringent than mine, because it's like, this is what happened. You see, kindness is infectious. When you see somebody, they see you. They don't feel anymore, oh, you're judging me. No, I'm eating. Are you sure I'm coming? How do I make you comfortable? And then there was only once that it happened to me that I was actually confronted with an issue. Other than that, I felt half the time that I was on United. It's like it was like triple wrapped, and it was like, no, I can eat it. No, it's like, I don't want plastic. Can I please have silverware? No, Rabbi, we're honoring you. It's like, thank you. So it's spilt all over me. No, it's like, because you can't, there's certain things you can't cut with plastic. There's just not going to, but no, Rabbi, for you,
Only plastic.
Only plastic.
Only the best plastic. So there's a joke about that. There's a Yom Kippur afternoon in Berlin. Two Orthodox Jews are walking during the break between Musaf and Mincha, and they see these two Reformed Jews going into a restaurant. And they confront them and they say, we know that you're Jewish, you're going to a restaurant at Yom Kippur. And they said, no, we just came from the Reformed synagogue down the block, and our rabbi just gave a sermon about ethical monotheism, and the most important thing to do is to be a good person. And so we don't have to fast, we're going to have lunch. And they walk into the restaurant, and one Orthodox Jew looks at the other and said, those guys are fools. Instead of fasting for one day, they have to be ethical the whole year. Okay.
That's very deep. It's like, it's not funny.
Okay, so I just want to, just one sentence that really struck me about God. I want to talk a little bit about God, because there's a theology here. There's a theology here that's underlying the entire project that I want to kind of rise to the surface. So on page 97, you make this kind of statement in passing, but I think it's actually dropping a bomb. You see, the concept of divine transcendence once again leads conceptually and all too often historically to moral corruption in the name of religious piety. So in a sense, you want to make God less transcendent, but you also want to make God a little bit further away. from us as people, to allow us the space to exercise our human will. So I'm not sure where that goes, right? The transcendence of God is bad because then there's no space left. But you don't want God too immanent either. So where do you want to put God here?
Second.
Second. But where, in other words, when is he permitted in? When is he excluded?
See, the problem is
when is he invited? When is he disinvited?
See, the problem is not where you put God. The problem is what else accompanies you.
Okay.
It's God could enter into your life as long as you have a firmly embedded moral universe, which is not dependent on God, not dependent on religion, which you know has to take priority over God. It's like when you invite a guest into your home and you have a family. You know, it's like when things have to work with each other. It's when one takes up too much space that no one else wants to be around the table. God and religion always have to be tested by an independent moral criteria which they don't govern. They always have to recognize that your moral responsibilities are going to come first. And God, so welcome. You're welcome into my life, and I want to live with you. You're an integral part of my life. I want you with me. I want you with me at so many different times of my life. But I don't want you to cause me to forget some of the fundamental things that always must be a part of my life. And so I'm not trying to put God, I want to allow God to flow freely into our life without being destructive. Do I want the cake and eat it? Maybe. I might. And it's not simple. For many years of my life, it's true. For many years, I've been so disturbed by God that I don't really let God in enough. That's the downside of my theology. Mm-hmm. I have a God I can live with, but I'm not always that compelled to make a call. But that's not what I'm. And one of the things that haunts me, and I don't know, is that the necessary consequence of this book? I hope it's not. And part of my religious life now is letting more and more room for God into my life. But letting God into my life will never allow a force who will determine for me what is the good. And I'll never allow someone in my life that's going to make me morally blind to the primacy of the other over God. And now, is this an impossibility? I don't know. I hope it's not. I hope it's not. I know that there's a major trend in Judaism which agrees with me. There's also a major trend in Judaism which disagrees with me. We'll see.
Well, what you strongly believe in the book is the autonomy of the human will and human reason to determine the good. That's the basic core belief. And that God has to conform, in order for God to be invited in, he has to conform to your conception of the good.
Correct.
So what in a certain sense, it's a kind of Maimonidean, Kantian religion, that it's not that it's holy because God said it, right? Or how does it work? It's holy because I think
Does God love it because it's holy, or is it holy because God loves
right.
it? Right.
And so what is it for you?
It's only holy. God loves it because it is good. It's God doesn't determine the good. And I want to be even more precise, and I don't know if I was as precise as necessary in the book. I don't believe that the human being has an innate capacity to understand and to determine the good.
You don't believe that?
No.
Okay.
I believe that a human being has the capacity to determine and know a good. I don't claim that the human knowledge of good is infallible. I don't think I was as, I should have made that clear,
Yeah.
but it's too late.
Right. Well, not for everybody here, because you
And
can-
not for the Hebrew version.
Okay.
No, I made it, but I didn't make it as, because people, it's not clear enough. People, I don't believe that human ethics are, that a human conscience is infallible. We know that it's fallible. But at any given time, our moral responsibility is to that which we know now. Now, I don't believe, like Kant, that there is a universal ethic that is consistent and is always applicable, even though his category is more a rule and not in the specifics. I think the specifics of human moral knowledge are going to change over time. But at any given time, what it is that we know now is that which obligates us. Mm-hmm. And therefore, religion must always be, ethics must always be independent of religion, so that you always have a check and balance on what religion says. And so religion could command me to discriminate against women. Religion could command me to discriminate against non-Jews. Religion could command me to discriminate against gays and lesbians. Well, 20 years ago, I didn't know that you couldn't discriminate against gays and lesbians. Well, let's say 30 years ago. I didn't know. I thought, oh, that's not natural. There's something wrong. Of course I'm supposed to discriminate. Now I know better. So now I am obligated by what I know now. And that is part of the evolution of human society. And we have to make sure that religion doesn't keep us back from the core moral truths that we are unveiling as we move forward. Now, there are times when it could be that we will unveil something that's a moral regression instead of a moral improvement. That's possible.
Do you have
That's
is there an example of that? Do you have an example of that?
Nazism could be an example of it. Mm-hmm. Could be an example. Racism could be an example of it. I think Nazism is a certain concrete model that reaches a level of evil I don't think we prepared for beforehand.
Right.
There was racism beforehand, but I think we're getting better at our racism. In a sense, like we're even better. It's like, I think we're reaching higher levels of racist or xenophobic. Like we're getting more sophisticated at it. But it could be that sometimes we'll go down the wrong course. And at that time, human society or human civilization will move backwards. But religion is never going to be the corrective.
Right.
Religion is not the corrective against human misconceptions of the good. Religion could only be the corrective of human beings not fulfilling the good that they know they ought to do. The job of religion is to remind you to do the good. The job of religion is to create a ritual system that regulates the doing of the good. It's never the determinant of the good, because when it is, you have unleashed a power on human society which is completely unchecked. Because then if I get up and say, God said to me A, B, C, or D, there's no argument that could counter something, counter M something. There's nothing. It's there. It's immutable. It's permanent. It sits there, and and not only can I not argue against it, I am religiously obligated to overcome that which I know. I'm obligated to offer my son.
Right.
And so I believe that human beings, we know a good. We know a good. We do. And my hope is, and I do believe, basically, that over time, human beings' knowledge of a good has been improving by and large. I think our knowledge of a good today is much better than our knowledge in the Middle Ages. Much better than our knowledge 30 years ago. And so I trust that human knowledge, and I believe it's the only way, or the safest way, to create a morally decent society.
So could the title of the book have been Putting Religion Second?
No, because the problem is not religion, the problem is monotheism.
Problem
as you
is
said.
monotheism. Right.
I could have said put monotheism, but no one would have bought it.
Yeah, right.
No, it's like it's too complicated.
Right,
It's like that's trying to be too clever.
Right. So tell us, given what you've said, how you fit. What is your understanding of revelation within this system? What function does it? What is it, and what function does it play?
Revelation has a function to create a system that encourages and reminds people to do the good, reminds them to do that which they know they ought to do. That's one part of revelation. But the other part of revelation is to create a place where human beings feel that they are hearing the Word of God. And that to hear the Word of God is an important part of what it means to live a life of value. And so I want to live with God. And revelation gives me a window into the will of God. There are people who have religious experiences all the time. There are people of religious and spiritual excellence who engage God in one-on-one conversations. Revelation is for all of us who don't have that. Revelation is to create for us a place where I encounter the Word of God. I encounter it. Now, in sometimes I have to reject it. And sometimes I hear God saying what God is saying, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, that's just not good enough. I answer to a higher authority.
Right.
But at other times, it provides me with an opportunity to walk with the transcendent being, and to engage in a life with that and to feel that as I do so, I am walking with God. So revelation both has a purpose for our moral responsibilities, and it has a very, very important place in our desire to meet. And some of us could meet in experiences, and part of the history of every monotheistic tradition is to allow us to meet God through a book. It's a very interesting concept, to meet God through a book. I think that's one of the primary religious inspirations for revelation.
You know, in the preface to Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, he tells the story of a pastor who gives an impassioned sermon about the binding of Isaac. And then one of his congregants goes back and basically tries to kill his son. And the pastor is called, and he comes in and says, "What are you doing?" He said, you just gave us Abraham as this heroic figure. And the pastor says, "Are you insane?" And he says, "No, but this is Abraham, right?" So in a certain way, the pastor is stuck.
That's right.
Right? How can he actually preach the great heroic act, and yet on the other hand, tell this person that what he's about to do is insane? So when a person says, or if I would say, revelation means to me, or God said to me, to kill this other person, are you saying to me, you didn't hear God? Or are you saying to me, what God told you is wrong?
What God told you is wrong.
So God's not such a good guy for you.
Some of the time.
Some of the time. Uh-huh.
I think God, and as in chapter 5 I write about what happens. The book is what happens to human beings when enters into the room. There's also something that happens to God when human beings enter into the room.
Okay.
And what happens is that certain ideas relevant for a particular time achieve a sacred significance that they're not worthy of. A perfect God can't give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people. And I believe that God commanded Abraham to kill his son. But I know that that's wrong. And I know that that's wrong today. And part of my responsibility is to sometimes protect God against God's self, but also to protect God from always being connected to statements that might make sense within a particular historical time that lose their value when God is speaking to me. There's something that might have made theological sense in antiquity that we get stuck with for all of history. And I don't go into this in this book, but an inherent part, I believe, of our tradition. I'm working now on another book called Who Are the Jews? Maybe my next third one might be on the gods of Judaism. But our tradition believes that sometimes God needs to be helped from God's self. And I was just at a conference, a philosophy conference, where Omri, I forget his last name, from the New School, gave a beautiful reading of Genesis 18, where it says in Genesis 18, "For I know him, I have selected him, so that he will walk in the way of God by doing what is just and right." And that's the way it gets translated in the JPS. And he actually reads it really carefully. To walk in the way of God by doing what is just and right. And he turns it to make sure that walking in the way of God is doing that walking in the way of God is doing the justice and the righteous. That sometimes God's self might lose that direction too.
Okay, so...
and Abraham, by the way, assumes that that's his job.
Right. So then, if we were able to make God smaller, we would have a better chance of being better people.
Yes. Or if we would make, not God smaller, if we make God a little less significant in our lives. And I know a lot of people think that's a very heretical thing to say.
Well, it's kind of.
No, like I joke about it. I say, I didn't say put God 14th. No, I think second is not bad. No, and I think, and I actually believe the God that I want to believe in wants to be second.
Right, I think that in a certain sense, that argument, that God wants to be second, and being able to flesh that out, would in a certain sense round out. Because in Revelation, God doesn't seem to want to be second, because God is saying, as you said this morning, right? You're with me or I kill you. You're with me or you're with them. It's not, I am the Lord your God, that's so significant, but there should be no other gods before me. So it doesn't seem in that scenario that God's really interested in second place.
That's true, but then you have in Isaiah where God says, stop worshiping me so much.
Yes.
So what happened, like, stop showing up all the time and giving me a goat. I don't want any more goats. I'm nauseous from your goats. This is not Donniel, this is Isaiah, this is all the prophets. Yeah. Stop giving me a goat. Stop showing up and saying how much you love me. Get out of shul and start helping the poor people. Stop fasting and saying, oh God, you're my God, I love you, I love you, I love you, God, 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 God. Close the siddur and get out and do something. So there are these two impulses.
Well, you know, there was a famous rabbi who also said that. His name was Jesus, right?
That's correct. So, and it's very interesting how many, we get so inhibited by what other people say. It's like, I remember I was once debating an Orthodox rabbi on issues of gender equality, and he took my argument and he says, "1 second, I want to read to you something." And he turns to the audience, he opens up a book, and he starts quoting about the need to have gender equality. And he says, "And do you know who said this?" And the author was a Reform rabbi. And that was supposed to constitute an argument, right? So my answer to him was, you wait a second. And I opened up a siddur, and I said, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Reform and conservative Jews say that too. Are you going to stop saying it because they said it? So are we going to start arguing on the basis of who says something? Are we going to start arguing on what's... So, and that's part... I know. Now, again, but by the way, Christianity, they suffer from the same autoimmune disease. And, if all of Christianity was Matthew, maybe I'd become Christian. The Sermon on the, could I live in the Sermon on the Mount? Yeah, it's pretty good. But you have Revelations, too.
Right.
So every one of our religious traditions, you have John. Every one of our religious traditions suffers from this dichotomy. And it's not just a Jewish story. And part of my hope is that Christians and Muslims will write a similar book. They'll do it differently. They might not be able to say, put God second. They might have to find a different way to argue it. But the end, the consequence has to be the same. Jews were more comfortable being a little more heretical. We play with God in ways that other religious traditions, we have fun. We have a sense of humor. Our God has that sense of humor and allows for it. But I believe that this language of putting God second actually frees a certain theological life. So often I sit in my life, it's do I really want this God? Is there a mitzvah for me to uproot God in my life? Because if God is the cause for so much evil, do I have to uproot God's claim on me? And this book is saying you don't have to. It's not about God removing God from your life. It's actually enabling God to be in your life, but in this way, not to be the destructive force that too often God is. Now, I'm not arguing that God always is a destructive force. For many people, God is a huge catalyst for good. Huge. That is precisely a language which sees you, that feels that God obligates us to do the good and that human beings are created in the image of God. All of that, there's a huge current within monotheism that encourages the good. But too often we stop there and then we call all the other abuses of religion somehow a misquote. And they're not a misquote. And as I say, one of my favorite Shakespeareans is that the devil quotes Scripture. The devil doesn't have to misquote Scripture. And that means that as religious people, we have to find every one of those chapters that the devil quotes. We have to find every one of those commandments that the devil quotes. And that we are religiously obligated to declare war on them. And you're only able to declare war on them when you say that they're there. When you say that they're not there, it's like an infectious disease that festers inside of you. And part of my critique against the whole political language towards Islamic terror is that we're not creating we're not challenging. And by the way, it's not from the outside, it's from the inside. That as a Muslim, I don't have to get up and say, I have a real problem. No, I have no problem. Yes, you do have a problem. And unless you recognize your problem, you're not going to deal with it. And here in Israel, Judaism, there is no problem. Abraham was never supposed to. That's not what God wanted. All that God wants is for you to love everybody and to hug them and cuddle them. And I know it's not true. I know, and I didn't write this in the book in English. In the book in Hebrew, there's going to be other sections where I'm going to speak much more honestly about some of my feelings towards the failings of Israeli society. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to do it in English. The book was, it's not the place I want to be in. I want to talk to, because this book wasn't just meant for, I don't want to. I think there's enough stuff being thrown at Israel that I didn't have to add more. But I have some stuff to talk about to Israelis. We have to talk. We really need to talk. And I'm doing it in Hebrew. Similarly, there is a God language which enables us. We saw part of it in Genesis 12 today. There's a God language which is getting married to nationalism. That's very, very scary. When we go to war in Gaza, a brigade commander tells all of his soldiers, have no fear, God is fighting with you. And I remember I was asked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come to speak to them about whether religion and faith makes better soldiers or not. And I said to them, on one level, sure, it makes a better soldier. That if you believe that God's fighting with you, you might be more courageous. You might have greater conviction. But what is it that is going to constitute success? Is it achieving a certain goal or fighting a war justly? And when God is in the battlefield, does God make you more sensitive towards civilian casualties or not? Again, it depends whether you're Genesis 12 or Genesis 18. But Genesis 12 is there. And part of what's happening, and I didn't go into it in great depth this morning, but I hinted to it, what happens when a certain political reality of Israel makes Genesis 12 more dominant? When a political reality makes God intoxication more dominant. And therefore, honest talk about who we are is not dangerous. Depends where you do it and how. It's not dangerous. It's actually necessary for moral growth. At the end of the day, I know I want to borrow another Christian concept. Call it original sin. But original sin actually exists in Genesis.
Well, it exists all over.
Exists all over.
Right.
What original sin means, see, in its Christian reading, original sin means that you could never be worthy of being loved by God. That's actually not what original sin means. Original sin in its Christian reading says you can never be loved by God, and therefore the only way you will be loved by God is through an act of grace of God. That you, on your own, you can never deserve it.
Right.
What original sin says is that human beings have an inherent propensity to fail, and that human beings will never be who they ought to be. Never be who they ought to be. That's a really healthy notion. It's when we don't think that you're a sinner that I get really nervous. And if we will never be who we ought to be, then we have to make sure that we always have an ongoing check and balance. Ongoing voices challenging us and asking us, who are you? What should you be? How could you do better? And so there's a very common statement in Israel which goes, nobody will teach us ethics. Af echad lo yelamed otanu musar. No one will teach us ethics. Do you know how dangerous that statement is? No one's going to teach you ethics. We have a religious party which runs its campaign with the following slogan, Dai lehitnatzel, no more apologizing. Really?
Right.
Now, if as religious people we believe that every human being fails, why would a religious person say, I'm not what do you mean not apologizing? What, you're done? You're done?
Right.
No one's going to teach you ethics, therefore you're immune? Therefore anything you do? For 11 minutes we left a person, a wounded terrorist. For 11 minutes we left him and nobody came to offer him medical assistance. 11 minutes. I think, and I'm not creating an equation, but again, you have to understand, for this, we call this person a terrorist. When my brother-in-law's plane was shot down and he died, could he have lived? Was there somebody there who could have offered him assistance?
Right.
Could there have been? Does a Jewish army? Is that what we do? Someone asked me this before, and it was a beautiful question. Doing justice doesn't mean not caring about Jewish life. I'm morally responsible to care about my life. When I care about Jewish life, when I care about Israeli society, I'm doing justice. Self-protection is not amoral. It's part of my moral responsibility. To walk in the way of God by doing what is just and right is also to look out for me. But when the danger is over, what do you do? Self-defense allows you to use lethal force to protect your life because you have a moral responsibility to live. But when does it stop? 11 minutes? What were all the people feeling as you were standing around? That's not what we should be doing. And the notion no one's going to teach us ethics? No one? That's what happens when you have this type of manipulation. And as Stephen Greenberg said to me beforehand, what makes it even worse sometimes is that that type of moral blindness is not only theologically. Sometimes it's like it starts from a theological place and then you turn around and then it's just simple nationalistic arrogance. But it comes from a theological like you grow up that way. You're going to teach me ethics? No one's going to teach me ethics. And therefore we've created this, anybody who critiques me is an anti-Semite. Why would anybody who critique me be an anti-Semite? This is the way the argument goes. You're an anti-Semite for critiquing me. Why? Did you critique Syria? If you didn't critique Syria and you're critiquing me, the only reason why you're critiquing me is because I'm a Jew and therefore what are you? An anti-Semite. If someone argues and says, yes, I did critique Syria, then the response is, how many times did you critique Syria? Have you critiqued them in direct proportion to the amount of deaths that they've done more than us? So if you critique Syria to a ratio of 10,000 to 1, then you're not an anti-Semite. 1,000 to 1, you're an anti-Semite. And in this way, we create a language in which no one will teach us ethics. And then there's no checks and balances.
So we need a little bit less God to be better people. But if we diminish God too much, we become worse people.
Or
we have too much God, we become God intoxicated, and we don't have ethics. If we have too little God, we don't have God, so we don't have ethics.
No. Go
ahead.
No, I don't believe you need to believe in God in order to be a good Jew.
Or an ethical person.
But I believe if you have too much God, it can make you less ethical. If you have not enough God, you lose something very powerful that creates a life of meaning. Not necessarily a force for ethical, but a force for spiritual existence, which has a value unto itself. Right. All of human life is not simply loving your neighbor as yourself. And when we don't have enough God, there's parts of our lives that are shut down. And so I want a little less God, but I don't want too little God.
Right.
I want
just enough.
Or I want a lot, but not too much. In other words, it's not just I want a lot, but not too much.
Right. So one of the things that's interesting about the book is, you're engaging in this book in a close reading of a series of rabbinic and biblical prophetic texts. And one of the things that I wondered as I read the book was, where are Donniel's influences? In other words, who do you think got it right before you? Or who was in the right direction? Who are the people that you read that pushed you in this kind of direction? Let's take your father out of the picture for a moment, excluding your father.
Excluding your father.
Because let's say your father.
That was a big one.
Yes, that was a big one. No, I understand.
That was a big one.
That was a big one. But with your father, I can tell you from your father's writings the other people like Soloveitchik or Kierkegaard. But in this book, we don't get a sense who is Donniel reading.
It's different figure. It's Shimon ben Shetach's. It's not it's not this or that philosopher or scholar. It's living your life and meeting an Abraham in stone. It's living your life and meeting a Shimon ben Shetach, this remarkable individual. It's like this. It shapes my life. Like when I grew up where these people were some of my best friends. Now, that has to do with the fact that when you make Aliyah, you're quite lonely. So it's like you don't really have a lot of friends, and when you're 4'11" in grade 11, 4'11" in grade 11, not too many girls want to go out with you on a date. So various rabbis of the Talmud are your friends. You have to compensate with something. These were like when I meet a Shimon ben Shetach, this man who when someone says to them, some of you I think learned some of that today. When Shimon ben Shetach is told by his students, Rebbe, we won the lottery. We bought you a donkey, and the stupid goy didn't know that there was a ruby connected to the donkey. we only paid $10 and we got $1 million in return. That is a great day for us. And not only is it a great day for us, I'm sure, God is the one who do you think provided this ruby? And Shimon ben Shetach says, who did this non-Jew know that the ruby was there? And his students say, no, that's the whole thing. He doesn't know. We tricked him. He doesn't know. And Shimon ben Shetach looks at him and says, give it back. It's like, that, when I meet, those people inspired me. Mm-hmm. Eric Fromm was also important.
Okay.
But it's like the people who really inspired me.
Right.
are as you move along, and then without doubt, the most significant figure who would hate this book, but who I am following in my version of some of his teachings is Maimonides. Mm-hmm. Maimonides would say that putting God second is the ultimate heresy. But Maimonides put truth first. But for him, truth and God were one. And he didn't want to assume, what do you do when there's a problem? Living 1,500 years after Maimonides, I think it's time to recognize that God and the ethical and God and truth are not one. And that if you're really committed to truth and you're really committed to the good, you also have to be open to the fact that that you're going to have to correct God too. Mm-hmm. And that you can't just take the easy path. I think Maimonides in a certain sense couldn't conceivably use this language. And he said, no, it's always solvable through interpretation. But that core principle of Maimonides was the major influence. The other major influence in my life was negative. Some of the hardest moments in my life were my personal experiences of God intoxication and God manipulation. Some of them addressed to me very directly. One of the interesting things in a life is, what does it mean to grow up in classical Orthodox yeshivot with the last name Hartman? You experience a lot of interesting people doing a lot of interesting things in the name of God.
And you get put second a lot, probably, too.
Oh, you don't get, it gets much worse than that. Right. And in the book, I tell a story about the war in Lebanon, which was also, throughout my life, I've met religiously intoxicated people. And they've been so unattractive to me. And I could have let them define Judaism. And instead, I was raised to fight not to let them define the Judaism that I don't want to live. Don't let them define that type of Judaism. You define Judaism. And when you meet these people who just don't see you, who just don't. I had this rabbi who was the head of our yeshiva, one of the most prominent rabbis in modern Orthodoxy. And he started to hate my father, but because he was a profoundly moral human being and I did well on the test, his akeda was accepting me into the yeshiva. I have to accept him. You pass the test. And I think it was in the 1970-something when Cambodian boat people were drowning all over the world. Were drowning in the Far East. Right. And Israel, under Menachem Begin, said, we know what it's like to be on a boat. We have to welcome people here. Menachem Begin was one of the most moral politicians that Israel has ever created. Yeah. And somebody who would never let even his national intoxication override his moral responsibility. Remarkable, remarkable individual. And one of the paradigms to show that ethics is not a left-wing, right-wing conversation. Even though I never voted for him, I have.
Right. Yes, yeah.
And so I remember at the time there was a telethon for raising money for the both people, and I saw Bezek, the electrical company, the telephone company, this place, this theater. Everybody was like they were printing. What was your donation? Like and I said, there's no religious institutions doing this. So I went to my Rosh Yeshiva and I said, I was like, you have to realize, they didn't like me. But I was just very, very...
You got that. That part we
but
got.
I was really, really naive. Like, I was the only one in the yeshiva who didn't have a roommate. No, for 2 years, I was the only one who didn't have a roommate. People were 3 in a room. No, and they decided that I just, no, you're just, it was like you were here, but, it was like, so it was very interesting. Being shunned, by the way, makes you a better human being. It's painful, but it makes you a better human being. But I didn't really, I just said, I'm going to go speak to him. So I knock at his door, and he's never spoke to nothing. And I say to him, Rabbi, I want to put out a box at the entrance to our dining room, which will collect money for for resettling of the Cambodians here in Israel. And then I want to put it on television saying, money was raised from this and this yeshiva. And I said to him, this is what we have to do as Jews. Because we know what it's like. And we know what it's like to have been in this situation, and we have a responsibility. And I said, would you be willing to speak to I had real chutzpah. Would you be willing to speak to the whole yeshiva
Excuse me.
before I put the box down? And he looks at me and he says, good. Yeah. That was the conversation. Yeah. Thank you. Bye. Okay. So he's going to do it. The next day, he bangs on the table, and everybody is quiet, and he says, a student came to me yesterday and said that we have to support the resettlement of Cambodians here in Israel because we know what it's like to be on a boat without a port to land in. Foolishness and stupidity. Foolishness and stupidity. Now here it is. I'm his student. I'm in your office. You could have said to me, Donniel, that's interesting, or you could have even said foolishness and stupidity to me. I was in your office. Like, what was it? Here it is. He's an educator, a moral human being. Foolishness. And instead, he feels religiously sanctified and even religiously motivated in front of 400 other people who he is their spiritual leader to shame me, embarrass me in front of everyone. Like, in what religious universe does he live? And then what's so paradoxical is he says, foolishness and stupidity. We Jews don't do things because we experience them. So I felt like saying, did you ever read Leviticus 19, love the stranger for you were a stranger? But the conversation was over by then. And then he says, the only question is whether we are halachically obligated. And then he starts making an argument as to why we're halachically obligated. He could have talked to me. I've encountered in my life so many people who, because of their profound faith, just don't sweat the little things. And those little things happen to be human feelings, human needs, that somehow they're big picture people. God makes you a big picture person. And I'm not going to let them win.
Well, please. It's really been an honor to sit at this stage with you, this makeshift stage with you, and listen to the Torah She'Ba'al Peh of the Torah She'Bechtav, the oral law to the written law, and I really, I understood it the first time. I saw how subversive it was. The second time, I'm afraid to read it the third time.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to choose? Okay, well, you just handed the mic to somebody, so took away my free will there. Go ahead.
You had mentioned the 11 minutes, and let's assume that terrorists killed 30 people. But let's also, and then I understand the ethics behind what you said, but let's assume that one of those 30 people was my mother, or a sister, or my grandson. Like your book, I think I would put ethics second.
You might, but that doesn't mean you're right. And again, I could understand the circumstances. But our responsibility is like, I'll give you an example. Do we have the death penalty in Israel or not? We don't. We don't have, except for one case. We don't have the death penalty. If the legal system wants to institute the death penalty, we have a right to do so. If we would argue that terrorists should be put to death, I don't believe there is a moral argument against it. I might vote against it because I think it will be bad for Israel. And that every single time we put someone to death, it's like I could see the months and months. I think it is just political suicide. But I'm not arguing that the death penalty for terrorists is morally wrong. I'm not. But because you have a death penalty for terrorists, even if we did, it doesn't mean that you are the judge and the jury and the executioner. Now, I could understand that in the Middle East, you can get profoundly angry at people who want to kill you. I understand that. But our challenge is to be Jews in the Middle East. Otherwise, let's move back to America. And that means, that's true, and that means that at times we're going to have to accept that the judicial system is going to determine what the destiny of this terrorist is and what it's not. And I know it's hard. And as distinct from many of you, while my mother, thank God, is alive, many of my good friends are not. And terrorists blew up friends of mine. They almost killed my children. My children were 5 yards away from a terrorist going like this. 5 yards away from a terrorist going like this. And many of you who've been with me for many years know this went back many years ago. My youngest daughter, who's now 25, she was shopping for a bat mitzvah dress. And I told her, you can't go to town, you have to stay on Emek Rephaim because downtown is dangerous. So she stayed on Emek Rephaim. And you know where Kafit is now? Well, Kafit was right across the street. And she was crossing the street with her sister Michal, who some of you studied with, who went shopping with her to the safe place. And Michal's boyfriend was in Kafit. And they were in the middle of the walkway, walking to go into Focaccia now. And there's a terrorist going like this. So, I'm not an armchair moral critic of what Israel ought to do. I live here. And it's precisely because I live here that I know that our greatest strength is not shooting that terrorist, but actually offering him medical assistance. And that when we do so, we are a stronger people and we're a stronger army. I do know that our impulse might be to the opposite, and I could understand it. But I definitely don't justify it. And it is precisely that which is going to give us our greatest strength. And as I argued this morning, it is that which the army knows gives us our greatest strength. My son went to war in Gaza. And I was petrified. And I told him, Yitzi, I want you to do me a favor. When you're in doubt, I want you to shoot first. When you're in doubt, I want you to shoot first, because then you're going to come home. And then we'll talk about it. But that was only when you're in doubt. When you're not in doubt, I never said to my son, shoot first. Even if because I know that he would have never come home. And if he would have come home, he wouldn't have been Yitzi. It would have been someone else. I want us to be Jews in the Middle East. And I know it's hard. But I think we can be Jews.
We'll take one more question.
Oh, sorry about that.
Donniel,
Sorry
right
about
here.
Oh.
My question seems almost pithy after you've just bared your soul, but I'll ask it anyways. I'd like you to explore a little bit more about your thesis of the natural evolution of the good in human beings, irrespective of religion or other forces. Because if you look at the history or the arc of history, one could construct a very good argument against that.
Correct.
Totalitarianism, communism, fascism. So where then are the roots of the natural evolution of the goodness of human beings? Where does that come from? And might it also be possible that the stasis of religion is at fault rather than religion itself?
I don't think the 20th century is a case for the failure of knowing the good, but it's a failure in our application of the good. Love your neighbor as yourself, even a recognition of inalienable rights of people, is pretty well widely accepted. What has changed is who do you apply them towards. If you look actually throughout human history for the last 2,000 years, there's been a remarkable consistency with regard to what constitutes the core moral responsibility. What shifts over time is the scope of who you apply that to. And I think the application of that has gotten broader and broader and broader. It's true, when I take a certain place within the 20th century, the application got shrunk, and then it was like a digression, and then we've moved forward again. Again, I want to be very precise because I say this over and again in the book. Because I argue that human beings have the capacity to know a good, it doesn't mean that people will do the good. There's a very big difference. And human beings will very often fail. Sometimes we'll fail because of nationalism. Sometimes we'll fail because of our greed. And sometimes we're going to fail because of our God. I don't argue that religion is worse than secular nationalisms and socialism, than secular fascism. I don't argue that religion is the sole source of evil, and in that I disagree with many of the new atheists who argue that if you only got rid of religion, everything would be fine. They somehow forgot the 20th century. I'm just arguing that religion doesn't always make you better, and the fact that religion is as bad as the other ones, or is no worse than the other ones, is not exactly a commercial for religion. This is a book which is not arguing on how we're going to solve all of human capacity to evil. It's just talking about one of those, which paradoxically we believe is supposed to save us from it. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because we believe that the great salvation of the evils of the 20th century is faith. That if we would have just believed, Nazi Germany would not have come into existence. Really? Nazi Germany actually, I believe, encapsulated, even though it did so in secular terms, profoundly God manipulation language, embedded within the monotheistic faith of much of its adherents. So it's I know that we as human beings are going to do, in one generation we might improve, in another generation we might digress. The job of religious tradition, when God is put second, is to ensure that we have a possibility in place to create the type of moral religious conversation that could be the enemy of injustice whenever it arises. Now, where does this come from? I don't know. I can't point to the gene that we have. I know that we as human beings think morally. I know that that is one of the features of humanity that distinguishes us from the animal world. I can't tell you where it comes from. Call it intuition, call it spirit, call it the image of God. We know a good. And we have to embrace that knowledge of that good. And when we embrace it, and when we create traditions that remind us of it, we have the potential to overcome its abuses. Its abuses by states, its abuses by evil human beings. Religion, I'm worried when religion becomes the maidservant of these causes instead of its critic. And I hope that's a sufficient response.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donniel. Thank you, Shaul, for a fantastic conversation. Books are for sale over here to your left. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.